Hello, Tara here. We are on chapter 25 of The Bridge to Belle Island. We're almost over with this. We've got about 3 more chapters left. So here we go. We know who done it. Hindered by the pouring rain, Dr. Grant examined Ben's bruised shin and swollen ankle, declaring the latter sprained and possibly fractured. He wrapped it securely to help support it until Ben could consult a surgeon, then returned his attention to his father, covering the man's lifeless body with his discarded coat. Benjamin limped into the house to pack up the papers Mr. Hardy had left behind in his haste to flee. He added the newer will to his case as well, thankful for God's nudging or whatever impulse had caused him to tuck it along with the letter into his coat pocket. Otherwise it might be in Hardy's possession right now, or lost to the swollen river. Then Ben went back outside, adding his case to the others being loaded onto the estate wagon. Shortly thereafter, the undertaker's cart bearing Silas Grant's body splashed through the rising water and rumbled over the bridge. Dr. Grant sat on the back, head hung low. When the estate wagon was finally loaded, Abel Curtis lifted the reins and urged the horse to walk on. Mrs. Philpott sat on the bench beside him, holding the puppy. Jacob, Carlotta, and a young maid sat in the back among the trunks and cases. Miss O'Toole and Manvers, he knew, had already ridden in the chaise with the elderly tenants to the inn, to wait with Rose and Mr. Adair for the weather to clear so they could start back to London. But for the present, the rain continued to fall. The water was now mere inches from the bridge deck and showed no signs of abating. On the veranda, Ben saw Captain Curtis talking earnestly to Isabel, asking her to leave with him, he guessed. Ben longed to interrupt, to plead his own case and hopes, whether Booker men were any good at expressing their feelings or not. But before he could, Isabel adamantly shook her head. Curtis pressed her hand and turned away, slinging a knapsack over his back. As he passed Benjamin, he said, "It's up to you, counselor. She won't heed me. Then again, she never did." The captain descended into the floodwaters, striding heedlessly through the murky flow in his tall Hessian boots. He still carried his gun, Benjamin noticed, perhaps anticipating the return of Mr. Hardy or the sailing barge. Ben called after him, "By the way, what did you say to Redknapp's men on the barge? Your father mentioned you hailed them." Curtis turned back. "I simply passed along Hardy's message. You remember. He said, 'I believe Enos Redknapp tried to kill me, probably killed Percival too. I'll see him hang if it's the last thing I do.'" The captain smirked. Enos seemed to find the words most interesting. Ben raised his chin with understanding. "Ah. And what will you do now? Not return to your former way of life, I hope." "No. I plan to take up the study of birds." "Birds?" Ben echoed in surprise. "Yes. I have been observing a rare and beautiful Spanish songbird, and am determined to learn all I can about her, perhaps even win her regard." "I see. Well, all the best to you both." With a grin, Curtis continued over the bridge. Benjamin splashed up the veranda steps to join Isabel near the front door. She held her father's old field glasses to her eyes and surveyed the village beyond. But even with a naked eye, Benjamin could see that the river had breached its banks there as well, covering the river road and climbing toward the shops and homes. "Mrs. Winkfield's garden is already under water," she said. "Poor thing will be devastated. All her beautiful flowers and the vegetables she practically lives on. Gone. And the water is nearing the courtyard of the inn, too. I hope Rose and Christopher and everyone else who went there for shelter will be all right." "They will be. You know you can trust Mrs. Philpotts to make arrangements to move everyone farther inland if Riverton itself is threatened." "True." "Time to go now, Isabel. You don't want to be trapped here." She lowered the glasses and gave a choked little laugh. "I do, actually. Have I not been so these last 10 years? This is different. You are risking your life. And mine." "Yours?" she asked, brows raised high. "I'm not leaving without you. Do I have to carry you?" She huffed. "Good luck with that. Teddy and his laudanum have already left, And you saw what happened when the officer tried to force me to leave. Very well, I won't try to force you, but I do beseech you most ardently. I will go with you. Rose is already on the other side. Your friends and neighbors are waiting to welcome you. Your tenants and workers need you, Isabel. You are the mistress of Belle Island, Riverton's main employer and benefactor to dozens of people. They will survive without me. Will they? How will Jenny and Mrs. Winkfield, Joe and the Joneses, Abel and the Houghtons get on without you? And what about Rose? You are her last living relative. And what about me? What about you? She retorted. You came here to discover Percival's murderer, and you did. End of story. He slowly shook his head. I hope that isn't true. I hope our story is just the beginning. I realize we have only known one another for, can it be less than a fortnight? But I have come to care for you, Isabel Wilder. A great deal. She stared at him, mouth ajar and eyes wide, clearly astonished. Oh, Benjamin, she breathed, expression softening. Touched to hear his Christian name on her lips, he stepped closer, pressing his advantage. Just come with me as far as the bridge. It's not yet submerged. Just that far. He extended his palm to her. Hold my hand, please. Her eyes, round and troubled, held his. She reached out and took his hand. He led her down the steps into the cold water, which felt good on his swollen ankle. Hold tight. Sloshing through knee-high water, Benjamin reached the bridge and stepped onto the first plank. He turned back to her, their hands still clasped. Will you take one step onto the bridge, Isabel? Join me here? In his peripheral vision, Benjamin noticed something ominously large looming toward him. He looked upriver and saw a wooden pier with metal railings rushing at him. It slammed into the bridge, shaking its foundations and shuddering along its length like a whip snapped by a giant's hand. The bridge lurched, and Benjamin's hip slammed into the railing. He almost fell over it, but it released Isabel and gripped the rail tight. Isabel cried out, Benjamin! Be careful! Come back! He shook his head and reached toward her once more. The bridge held. Take my hand, Isabel. Come with me. To safety. Safety? Here is safety. The island is where I am safe. Not anymore. Isabel's chest squeezed tight, and her legs trembled. Every fiber of her being wanted to remain where she was, on the island. Yet she could not deny it would be wise to seek higher ground, or that she was drawn to the man reaching toward her. She looked longingly back to the house. The water had reached the veranda and was still rising. Repairs would be needed to the house as well as the tenant cottages, and the weaving shed would need to be rebuilt on taller pilings. But what if she wasn't here to do so? Perhaps she might go up to the higher floors and wait out the flood on her own. The kitchen would be inaccessible, and all the food in the larder spoiled. But she would not starve to death, assuming the water receded in a few days or a week. How long could one live without food and fresh water? She supposed, if desperate, she could drink water directly from the Thames instead of their spring. But recalling all the flotsam in the river presently, her stomach soured at the thought. Even so, the island had been her refuge for years. It would shelter her even now. Would it not? Phrases she'd read in her father's Bible washed over her. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the waters roar and be troubled. She looked past Benjamin across the bridge. In her panicked state, the span seemed to constrict and stretch out in a dizzying illusion. She felt breathless and lightheaded, damp through from the water and perspiration. The flood roared in her ears, blocking out every other sound but Benjamin's appealing baritone voice. You can do it, Isabel. I know you can. I will help you. Isabel swallowed. She reminded herself that Rose was about to marry a man who had no interest in living on the island. If Isabel was not there, how long would it be until he convinced Rose to sell Belle Island to someone else, to a boat-yard or even a smuggler like Mr. Redknapp? Isabel shook her head. She had to stay alive and make sure that didn't happen. She reached for the railing. Anxiety rose up in her so strong she could barely breathe. She searched her mind for Mrs. Booker's exhortation and found it in her heart. Don't be anxious, but pray instead. Please, Lord, Isabel silently pleaded. Please help me. She took a step onto the bridge, a step of faith. But a long, narrow boat, unmanned and floundering, came straight toward them, wheeling sideways in the turbulent current. Isabel screamed. Slam! A cannon burst erupted in her ears, a shuddering collision knocking her off her feet. Benjamin's arms flew out and caught her before she could fall headlong into the swirling water. The world was spinning, shifting, floating. Oh, my heaven. The bridge had been knocked from its foundations and now floated free. Isabel clutched Benjamin with one hand and the railing with the other. She could hardly believe it. After all these years, she was on the dreaded bridge at the worst possible moment. So much for safety. She whipped her head around and watched in shock as her island whirled away from her. Then she looked the other way toward Riverton as they rushed past the churchyard, the floodwaters climbing its stone wall. She blinked at the startling sight and felt her world spin again. Isabel suddenly had a better understanding of what Mr. Booker must suffer with his vertigo, to be standing on something that should be solid and still, but was instead moving beneath one's feet. She looked up into his face, wondering how this wild ride was affecting him. She noticed him gripping the railing hard, expression tense. She prayed he would not become dizzy or incapacitated, not when their lives were at risk. But he met her gaze with strength and reassurance and held her closer. Benjamin's words echoed through her mind. I hope our story is just the beginning. I have come to care for you, Isabel Wilder, a great deal. But was their story about to end in violent death? Ahead, Isabel saw an obstacle in their way, the ruins of someone's old boathouse, lodged in a log-jammed inlet. Benjamin! She warned, then tensed, anticipating impact. The bridge that had become their life raft collided with the boathouse. They came to a sudden, jarring halt, and Benjamin lost his grip on her. Half the bridge ripped away. Isabel shrieked, falling toward the menacing current, but Benjamin's hand shot out and caught her once again. One arm clutching the railing, he bracketed his other arm around her waist, drawing her close, her back to his chest. Thank you, Isabel breathed. A loop of rope landed on the bridge near their feet. What in the world? Grab hold, Evan Curtis shouted from Riverton's shore. Tie it to the rail. Snagging her hand, Benjamin bent to grab the rope. Behind them, the old boathouse shifted and groaned, wood splintering as the powerful curtain tried to push it out of the way. Any second it would give, and they would be swept away with it. Already the beleaguered bridge was falling apart, section by section. How long would it hold them afloat? There, on the shore, she saw them. Rose and Mr. Adair watching anxiously. Carlotta and Mrs. Philpotts waiting with blankets. Jenny with her arm around young Joe. Arminda and her father, hands clasped in prayer. Abel and Jacob steadying two harnessed horses, the rope tied between them. Benjamin looked at the sagging railing, but hesitated. Instead, he looped the rope around them both and pulled it tight. With a reverberating crack, the boathouse came loose and lurched away. The bridge jerked to the side. One end rose, sending the other end down into the water, pulling the remaining section of bridge out from under them. The rope binding her to Benjamin dug deep, pressing against her chest and under her arms. For a moment they were held aloft. Then they hit the surface together. Going under, blind and suffocating, Isabel was sure she had breathed her last. She had left the island. What else had she expected? The curse was real and would continue with her. Yet something in her rebelled at the thought. That is superstition. God holds my fate in his hand. God alone. Might he allow her to die as he had the rest of her family? He might. But what happened to her was up to him. And either way she wanted to live. Oh God, forgive my many sins. Save my soul for Jesus' sake. The tension on the rope tightened as the horses waged battle with the current and their combined weight. She felt Benjamin beating the water with his hands and kicking with his feet, desperate to reach the surface, desperate for air. Suddenly their heads broke the surface. Isabel gasped, sucking in a watery breath and choking. She heard Benjamin sputter and cough behind her and praised God he was alive. On land, Abel and Jacob urged the horses up the rise, and the animals strained in their harnesses, pulling them from the water. Benjamin's arm came around her again, holding her close, easing the raw sting of the rope against her wet clothing. She knew she would be bruised, but better bruised and alive than dead. They reached solid ground at last. Lying there in the mud, Benjamin's arms around her, she closed her eyes and blessed relief. Voices swarmed, caring and familiar. "Make way for the horses. Clear a path. We have blankets and hot tea." "Where's Dr. Grant?" Rose's voice. "Aunt Belle? I'm here." "Thank God you're safe, Miss Wilder." Thank God indeed. She's finally off the island.